Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. My hands tremble as I write these words. The doctors say it's the trauma, but I know better. It's fear, raw and primal, that makes my fingers quiver against the paper. Fear that what happened in those ancient hills of Bulgaria might follow me through these pages. But I must document it all before my mind fractures completely, before I lose the ability to distinguish between reality and the horrors the mask showed me. 3 months ago, I was Dr. Eleanor Vance, respected archaeologist and tenured professor at Cambridge University. My colleagues described me as pragmatic to a fault, skeptical of anything that couldn't be carbon dated or catalogued with scientific precision. I'd built my reputation on methodical research and meticulous fieldwork across 3 continents. The Thracian tomb expedition was to be my crowning achievement, the discovery that would cement my legacy in the field of Bronze Age studies. Now, I sit in my London flat surrounded by sleeping pills I'm too afraid to take, jumping at shadows that seem to move just beyond my peripheral vision. The university has granted me an extended sabbatical for recovery, they said, but I've heard the whispers. They think I've lost my mind. Perhaps I have, but madness would be a mercy compared to the alternative, that everything we experienced was real. I assembled a small but capable team for the expedition. Dr. Samuel Keller, my colleague of 15 years, a thoughtful, meticulous man, whose expertise in ancient languages made him invaluable. Tessa Marshall, my brightest graduate student, whose enthusiasm and quick mind had always impressed me. Harrison Grant, our experienced field assistant, who had worked on digs from Peru to Mongolia, and Luca Dimitrov, our local guide, a man whose family had lived in the shadow of those Bulgarian mountains for generations. I remember the day we first gathered in my office, maps spread across my desk, the excitement palpable as I outlined our expedition to a site untouched by modern archaeologists, a Thracian burial chamber, rumoured to contain artifacts from a mysterious cult that had vanished without explanation in the 5th century BCE. None of us could have imagined what waited for us beneath those ancient stones. The journey to the site was arduous. After landing in Sofia, we drove for hours along increasingly narrow mountain roads, until even our rugged vehicles could go no further. The final leg was on foot, hiking steep paths through dense forests that seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each step. The villagers don't come to these hills, Luca told us on our second day of hiking, his voice low as though he feared being overheard by the ancient pines surrounding us. They say the forest remembers old gods. Harrison laughed, adjusting the heavy equipment pack on his shoulders. Good thing we're scientists and not superstitious locals then. Luca didn't smile. The old stories say a Thracian king made bargains with something hungry, something that lives in darkness. They say he was buried with a golden face to keep the hunger sealed away. A golden mask, Samuel mused, his scholar's mind already racing. That would be consistent with Thracian burial practices, though typically reserved for royalty. Yes, masks, Luca agreed, his eyes darting to the shadows between trees. But the stories don't call it a mask, they call it a prison. I dismiss these tales as local folklore, the kind that inevitably surrounds archaeological sites of significance. Every culture has its myths about disturbing the dead. As scientists, we respected cultural beliefs but didn't let them impede our work. How arrogant we were. We reached the excavation site on a Wednesday afternoon. The area had been flagged by a geological survey team the previous year, an anomaly in the hillside that suggested man-made chambers beneath the earth. A small test excavation had revealed the tip of a stone entrance clearly carved by human hands, but the survey team had gone no further, securing the site for proper archaeological assessment. The entrance was partially visible now, a dark mouth in the hillside surrounded by ancient stone markers. Even from a distance, the craftsmanship was evident. Precision stonework that had withstood millennia. "Look at the vegetation," Samuel noted as we approached. A perfect circle around the entrance was devoid of plant life. No moss, no weeds, nothing but bare, dark soil. That's unusual. "Soil composition could be hostile to growth," I suggested, but even as I said it, I noticed how the barren circle had an unnatural precision, as though drawn with a compass. We set up camp a respectful distance from the entrance, establishing our equipment and supply tents with practiced efficiency. As dusk fell, I noticed Luca placing small bundles of dried herbs at the corners of our camp. "Protection," he said simply when he caught my questioning glance. I didn't press him. That first night, none of us slept well. The mountain silence was too complete, too heavy. No insects chirped, no nocturnal animals rustled in the underbrush. Just a pressing stillness that made every small sound from our camp, a canvas flap moving in the breeze, someone turning in their sleeping bag, seemed jarringly loud. I dreamed of narrow stone corridors and voices speaking in a language I didn't understand, but somehow comprehended. They were discussing a hunger that could never be satisfied. I woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the mountain chill. Over breakfast, I discovered I wasn't alone in my restless night. "I kept hearing something," Harrison said, pouring himself his third cup of coffee. "Like scratching against stone. Thought it might be an animal, trying to dig into our supplies, but when I went to check, there was nothing there." "I dreamed of a golden face," Tessa said, her eyes bright with excitement rather than fear. "It was watching me from inside the hillside. I think it's a good omen." "Or your subconscious processing Luca's stories," Samuel suggested gently, but I noticed the dark circles under his eyes as well. We began our work that morning, carefully clearing the debris from the entrance. The stonework was remarkable. Massive blocks fitted together with such precision that after thousands of years, I couldn't slip a blade between them. The symbols carved around the entrance were unlike any Thracian writing I'd previously encountered, more angular, with recurring motifs that seemed almost pictographic. "These don't match any known Thracian script," Samuel murmured, photographing each section methodically. "There are elements of early Greek, perhaps some Phoenician influences, but the syntax is unusual." "Can you decipher any of it?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet. But this recurring symbol, the one that looks like an eye inside a crescent, appears at regular intervals. It might be a warning or a dedication." It took us 2 full days to clear the entrance properly and ensure it was structurally sound enough to enter. We worked methodically, documenting everything, while Luca watched from a distance, refusing to help with this particular task. "Bad air inside old tombs," he explained when Harrison pressed him. "Makes people see things that aren't there." On the 3rd day, we were ready to enter. We gathered our equipment, lights, cameras, basic tools, air quality monitors, and assembled at the entrance. The morning was unusually cold, our breath fogging in the air despite the late spring season. "I'll lead," I said, adjusting my headlamp. "Samuel behind me, then Tessa, Harrison at the rear. Luca, if you prefer to wait." "I will come," he interrupted, surprising me. "Someone must remember what happens." The entrance tunnel was narrow, forcing us to proceed in single file. The air was stale but breathable, our lights casting long shadows along walls, covered in elaborate frescoes. The paintings depicted processions of figures in ceremonial dress, carrying offerings to a seated figure wearing what appeared to be a golden mask. The artistry was exquisite, the pigments still vibrant after thousands of years in darkness. "These should have degraded," Samuel whispered, his light tracing the perfect lines of figures frozen in eternal worship. No natural pigment maintains this vibrancy without exposure to air and moisture. The tunnel descended gently for about 40 meters before opening into a larger chamber. As our light swept the space, we all fell silent in collective awe. Unlike most ancient tombs, this chamber showed no signs of the passage of time. No dust covered the intricately carved stone benches arranged in a semicircle. No cobwebs hung from the high ceiling with its astronomical map picked out in what appeared to be gold and lapis lazuli. At the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, and on the walls, more frescoes. These depicting scenes that I initially mistook for hunting parties, but soon recognized as something far more disturbing. "Those aren't animals they're pursuing," Tessa said, her voice tight. "They're people. Look at the faces." She was right. The figures in golden masks were hunting human prey, the scenes becoming increasingly violent as they progressed around the chamber. The final panel showed the masked hunters standing over their captured victims, using curved knives to remove something from their bodies, something depicted as a glowing essence being drawn into the masks themselves. "Ritualistic," Samuel murmured, photographing rapidly, perhaps symbolic of capturing the spirit. "This place is wrong," Luca said suddenly, his voice echoing. "The air tastes like metal." I noticed it then too, a strange, coppery taste in the back of my throat. Our light seemed to be dimming despite fresh batteries, the shadows growing thicker in the corners of the chamber. "Air quality monitors show normal oxygen levels," Harrison reported, checking the device. "No dangerous gases detected." "Let's continue," I said, trying to ignore the growing pressure behind my eyes, like the onset of a migraine. There should be a burial chamber nearby. We found it behind a false wall that, once we understood its mechanism, slid open with surprising ease. The burial chamber was smaller than the main room, but no less impressive. Stone shelves lined the walls, holding urns, weapons, jewelry, grave goods of exceptional quality. In the center, instead of the expected sarcophagus, we found a simple stone pedestal. "There's no body," Tessa observed, sweeping her light around the chamber. "No remains at all." "Unless they are under there," Harrison said, pointing to the pedestal. A thin seam was visible around its base, suggesting it might conceal a compartment beneath. It took all four of us to shift the stone top of the pedestal. It moved grudgingly, as though resisting our efforts, the grinding sound of stone against stone unnaturally loud in the confined space. As the slab finally slid aside, our lights illuminated a recessed compartment containing a single object. The mask seemed to absorb our light rather than reflect it. Made of what appeared to be solid gold, it was crafted in the image of a human face, but no human I had ever seen. The features were elegant, yet unsettling, with high cheekbones and a regal brow, but the expression was one of cruel amusement, lips curved in a knowing smile that revealed teeth too sharp for comfort. Most disturbing were the eyes, almond-shaped hollows that seemed bottomless, as though the mask was not a facade but a window into an infinite darkness. Around the edge of the mask, the same symbols we had seen at the entrance were etched in a continuous band, and at the center of the forehead, a single large character, the eye within a crescent that Samuel had noted earlier. "It's magnificent," I whispered, my archaeological training momentarily overcoming my unease. "Thracian craftsmanship at its finest." "Don't touch it," Luca said sharply, backing toward the entrance. "This is the face that drinks souls. This is what the stories warn about." But Tessa was already reaching for it, her expression rapt. "It's so beautiful," she murmured. "I can hear it singing." Before any of us could stop her, she lifted the mask from its resting place. I expected it to be heavy, given its apparent solid gold construction, but it moved easily in her hands, as though it weighed nothing at all. The moment the mask lost contact with the pedestal, I felt it, a change in pressure, a subtle shift in the air itself. The shadows in the corners of the chamber seemed to deepen, to pulse with a life of their own. The coppery taste in my mouth intensified. "Put it back," Samuel said, his scholarly composure cracking. "Tessa, put it back now." But Tessa was transfixed, turning the mask over in her hands, running her fingers along the etched symbols that, impossible as it seemed, appeared to writhe subtly beneath her touch. "There's something inside it," she said, her voice distant. "I can feel it watching me." "We should document it in situ before removing artifacts," I said, trying to appeal to her training. "Let's replace it for now, and photograph everything properly." She nodded absently, but made no move to return the mask. Instead, she carefully wrapped it in a preservation cloth and placed it in her specimen bag. "We'll document it above ground," she said. "The light is better there." None of us argued further. A sudden, collective urge to leave the chamber had overtaken us. A primitive instinct that recognized danger before our conscious minds could articulate it. We retraced our steps quickly, the return journey seeming longer somehow, the tunnel stretching beyond what I knew to be its physical dimensions. When we finally emerged into daylight, I was shocked to see the sun already setting. We had spent nearly 8 hours underground, though it had felt like no more than 2. The air outside tasted impossibly sweet after the metallic staleness of the tomb. That night everything changed. I awoke sometime past midnight to the sound of whispering. Rising from my tent, I found Tessa sitting by the dying embers of our campfire, the mask unwrapped before her, gleaming dully in the faint light. She was speaking to it in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not Bulgarian, not any modern tongue. "Tessa," I called softly, approaching cautiously. "You should be sleeping." She looked up, and for a moment I didn't recognize her. Her features seemed sharper somehow, her eyes reflecting the embers with an unnatural brightness. "It wants to be worn," she said, her voice hoarse. "It's been waiting so long, Eleanor. Centuries of darkness." "We'll examine it tomorrow," I said, reaching for the mask. "Let me put it away safely for tonight." My fingers were inches from the gold when a jolt of pain shot up my arm. Not from contact, but from proximity alone, as though the air around the mask was electrified. I jerked back with a gasp. "It doesn't want you," Tessa said, a strange smile playing at her lips. "It chose me the moment I touched it. I can hear its voice so clearly now." I backed away, a cold dread settling in my stomach. "I'm going to wake Samuel," I said. "We need to discuss this." But when I turned toward his tent, Tessa's hand shot out and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "Don't," she hissed. "They don't understand. Men never do." Her eyes met mine, and what I saw there sent ice through my veins. Her pupils had expanded until almost no iris remained, just bottomless black pools like the eye holes of the mask itself. I pulled free and ran to Samuel's tent, shaking him awake with frantic urgency. By the time we returned to the campfire, Tessa was gone, and so was the mask. We found her at the entrance to the tomb, trying to return inside, despite our agreement not to enter at night without proper lighting and safety measures. "It wants to go home," she kept saying as Samuel and I led her gently back to camp. "It's hungry after so long alone." We convinced her to relinquish the mask, which Samuel locked in a specimen case. For the remainder of the night, I sat outside her tent, listening to her mumble in that strange language, until she finally fell silent near dawn. "She's exhausted herself," Harrison said when he relieved me at first light. "Probably just overexcitement. You know how these graduate students get about their first major find." But I'd seen her eyes, heard the ancient words spill from her modern lips. This was no academic enthusiasm. Over breakfast, Tessa appeared normal, tired but coherent, with no memory of her nighttime activities. "I had the strangest dreams," she said, accepting a cup of coffee with a shaky smile. "I was walking through a city I didn't recognize, where everyone wore golden masks and spoke in songs. Samuel suggested we take a day to properly document our findings before re-entering the tomb. We set up a processing area where we photographed, measured, and catalogued the smaller artifacts we had retrieved. I deliberately left the locked case containing the mask until last. When we finally opened it, I half expected the mask to have transformed somehow, to have grown more menacing overnight. But it lay there, inert and beautiful, catching the sunlight with a dull gleam that seemed oddly muted for gold. The craftsmanship is remarkable, Samuel said, examining it through a magnifying glass. But I'm not convinced it's actually gold. The weight is wrong, and look at how it absorbs light, rather than reflects it. What else could it be? Harrison asked, peering over Samuel's shoulder. Some kind of ceramic with gold leaf. I've never seen any material quite like it, Samuel admitted. We'll need to take a small sample for analysis. When he attempted to scrape a tiny fragment from the inside edge, the blade of his precision scalpel snapped clean off. The mask remained unmarked. Harder than steel, Samuel murmured, examining the broken tool with a frown. That's not possible for gold, or any ancient alloy I'm familiar with. While Samuel continued his examination, I sorted through the photographs from the main chamber, trying to find clues about the mask's purpose and origin. The recurring motif of masked figures consuming something from their victims suggested a ritualistic significance beyond mere burial adornment. Look at this, Tessa said suddenly, pointing to one of the photos. The inscription above the hunting scene, I think I can read part of it. Samuel and I exchanged concerned glances. Tessa had no training in ancient languages. What does it say? I asked cautiously. The hunger that walks between worlds, she translated, her finger tracing symbols on the photograph. The face that feeds on... She stopped, blinking rapidly. I don't know how I knew that. That evening, our camp was subdued. Harrison complained of a persistent headache, and Samuel kept rubbing his eyes, claiming the light hurt them despite the overcast sky. I noticed Luca placing more of his herbal bundles around our tents, his expression grim. It's awake now, he told me when I approached him. It knows we're here. What is it, exactly? I asked, my scientific skepticism warring with growing unease. The old ones had many names for it, he said. The Thracians called it the thirsting god, a spirit that fed on human essence. The legends say it was tricked and bound into a golden face by a clever king, then buried where no one would disturb it. He glanced towards the specimen case where the mask was stored. Until now. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mask's features overlaid on my eyelids, its cruel smile widening as if in anticipation. Around midnight, I heard movement outside my tent and emerged to find Harrison standing motionless at the edge of our camp, staring into the darkness. Harrison, I called softly, are you all right? He turned slowly, his face oddly blank. There are people in the trees, he said flatly. They're watching us. I can see the gold reflecting. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the black silhouettes of pines against the marginally lighter night sky. There's no one there, I assured him. Come back to your tent. They've been there since we opened the stone, he insisted, his voice rising, waiting for us to fall asleep, waiting to take back what belongs to them. It took both Samuel and me to guide Harrison back to his tent, where he finally fell into a restless sleep after taking a mild sedative from our medical kit. When I returned to my own tent, I found the corners of my sleeping bag dusted with a fine, dark powder, the crushed remains of one of Luca's herbal bundles. The next day brought heavy fog that clung to the mountainside, reducing visibility to a few meters and casting our camp in a ghostly pall. We decided to postpone further excavation until the weather improved, and instead focused on analysing our findings. Samuel discovered a hidden compartment in the pedestal that had held the mask, a small recess containing a bundle of papyrus scrolls sealed in what appeared to be some form of ancient resin. The preservation was remarkable. When carefully unwrapped, the scrolls were perfectly legible, covered in the same angular script we had seen throughout the tomb. "This would be the find of a career even without the mask," Samuel said, his scholarly excitement momentarily overcoming the strange tension that had gripped our camp. "A completely preserved textual record from a Thracian cult." Tessa insisted on helping with the translation, claiming she recognized patterns in the text. Her aptitude was uncanny. She identified repeating phrases and proper nouns with ease, despite having no formal training in linguistics or ancient languages. "It's a ritual text," she explained, her fingers hovering over the papyrus as though reluctant to touch it directly. "Instructions for feeding the mask." "Feeding?" Samuel echoed. "You mean offerings? Sacrifices?" "Energy," Tessa said vaguely. "Life essence. The mask is a channel between worlds. It needs fuel to maintain the connection." I noticed her gaze drifting repeatedly to the specimen case, a hungry look that made my skin crawl. When Samuel suggested she take a break, she became disproportionately agitated. "We can't stop now," she snapped. "It's been waiting too long already. Can't you hear how impatient it's becoming?" That afternoon, I found her alone in the equipment tent, the mask in her hands, her expression one of rapturous concentration. She wasn't wearing it, not yet, but her fingers traced its features with intimate familiarity. "It fits perfectly," she whispered without looking up. "I tried it earlier, just for a moment. It was like coming home." I should have confiscated the mask then. Should have packed up our camp and left the mountains immediately. But academic ambition can be as powerful and blinding as any ancient curse. We had discovered something unprecedented, something that could rewrite our understanding of Thracian culture. Walking away was unthinkable. Instead, I convinced Tessa to return the mask to its case, then gathered everyone for a team meeting to establish new protocols. No one was to handle the mask alone. No one was to enter the tomb unaccompanied. We would document everything meticulously and maintain regular communication with our university liaison via satellite phone. It all seemed so rational, so responsible. We were scientists, after all. We could manage this discovery properly. That night I dreamed of ancient cities where golden-faced figures moved through streets lined with altars. I woke to the taste of copper in my mouth and the certainty that something was standing just outside my tent. Something that cast no shadow but displaced the air with its presence. Our 5th day at the site dawned clear and cold. Harrison didn't emerge from his tent until nearly noon, his eyes bloodshot, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "I need to destroy it," he said without preamble, when he finally joined us at the camp table. "The mask. We need to melt it down or bury it where no one will find it." "That would be academically irresponsible," Samuel began, but Harrison cut him off with a harsh laugh. "Academically irresponsible? Listen to yourself, Sam. There's nothing academic about what's happening here. That thing is alive. It gets into your head when you sleep." He turned to me, his eyes pleading. "You've felt it too, Eleanor. I know you have." Before I could respond, Tessa emerged from the equipment tent, her face flushed with excitement. "I've translated more of the scroll," she announced. "It explains everything. Why the mask was created, what it was meant to contain. It's extraordinary." According to Tessa's translation, the mask had been crafted to imprison a deity that had been banished from its own realm. A being of pure hunger that had discovered our world and found it rich with a form of energy it craved. The Thracian king had tricked the entity, offering himself as a host, but instead sealing it within the mask through a ritual sacrifice involving 13 willing victims. "The mask isn't the prison itself," Tessa explained, her eyes bright with a fervour that was becoming increasingly common. "It's the door to the prison. As long as it remains sealed and unworn, the entity stays trapped between worlds." And if someone wears it? I asked, already knowing the answer. Tessa's smile was terrible in its beauty. Then the door opens. That night, everything descended into chaos. I was awakened by screaming, raw, primal sounds that cut through the mountain silence like a blade. Fumbling for my flashlight, I rushed outside to find Harrison on his knees at the edge of camp, clawing at his own face, drawing blood in long furrows down his cheeks. Samuel reached him first, trying to restrain his hands while calling his name, but Harrison seemed beyond hearing, his screams dissolving into hoarse whimpers. "They're under my skin," he gasped between ragged breaths. "I can feel them moving beneath my face, trying to wear me from the inside out." It took both Samuel and me to sedate him, his strength terrifying as he fought against us. When he finally lost consciousness, I noticed strange marks forming on his forearms where he had touched the mask earlier that day, symbols that matched those etched around its edge, appearing as raised welts on his skin. We carried him to his tent, and I volunteered to stay with him, while Samuel went to check on Tessa and the mask. But Harrison's tent was stifling, the air thick with the coppery scent that had permeated the tomb. After ensuring he was breathing steadily, I stepped outside for a moment, drawing deep breaths of the cool night air. That's when I saw it, a pale figure moving gracefully between the trees at the edge of our camp, heading towards the tomb entrance. Even in the dim moonlight, I recognized Tessa's slender form and the glint of something she carried. I followed, calling her name softly, not wanting to wake the others, if this was simply another episode of sleepwalking. She didn't respond, continuing her steady progress toward the dark mouth in the hillside. As I drew closer, I realized she was already wearing the mask. It covered her face completely, its golden surface seeming to glow with an internal light that pulsed in rhythm with her steps. Her movements were too fluid, too precise, like a dancer performing carefully choreographed steps. "Tessa," I called again, louder this time. "Stop! Take off the mask." She paused at the entrance to the tomb, turning slowly toward me. The mask's expression hadn't changed. It couldn't, being solid metal. Yet somehow it seemed more alive, its cruel smile widening, its hollow eyes depthless in the moonlight. When she spoke, it wasn't Tessa's voice, but something ancient and multi-layered, as though many voices were speaking in unison. The vessel accepted me willingly. She opened the door and invited me through. I backed away, fear overriding academic curiosity. "What are you?" The masked figure tilted its head, an unnervingly bird-like motion. "I am the hunger between worlds. I am the thirst that can never be quenched." It took a step toward me, hand outstretched. "And you, Eleanor Vance, with your mind so ordered and precise, would make a perfect second vessel." I turned and ran, my heart hammering against my ribs. Behind me, I heard laughter, a sound like metal scraping against stone. I burst into our camp, shouting for Samuel and Luca. They emerged from their tents, confused and alarmed. "Tessa has the mask," I gasped. "She's wearing it. Something's wrong. It's not her anymore." Samuel grabbed a flashlight and our satellite phone. "I'll call for extraction. We need to get off this mountain." But the phone, which had been working perfectly that afternoon, now displayed no signal. Samuel tried repeatedly, his expression growing more desperate with each attempt. "It's blocking communication," Luca said grimly. "Doesn't want us to leave." "That's ridiculous," Samuel snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just interference from the mountains." A scream from Harrison's tent interrupted the argument. We rushed inside to find him convulsing, his back arched impossibly high, foam flecking his lips. The symbols on his arms had spread, covering his entire body in pulsing, angular lines that seemed to move beneath his skin. As we tried to stabilize him, a shadow fell across the tent entrance. The masked figure, Tessa, or what had once been Tessa, stood watching us, head still tilted at that unnatural angle. "He's rejecting the blessing," it said in that terrible, multi-layered voice. Such a waste of essence. I offered him visions of eternity, but his mind was too rigid to accept them. Samuel stepped forward, positioning himself between the figure and Harrison. What have you done to him? To Tessa? Tessa invited me in, the figure replied. She was curious about what lies between worlds. Now she sees everything. It raised a hand to caress the cold metal of its face. This prison cannot hold me any longer. After centuries of patience, I have a vessel again. Harrison's convulsions suddenly stopped, his body going limp. When I checked for a pulse, I found none. You killed him, I whispered, horror and rage warring within me. His essence was incompatible, the figure said dismissively, but there are 3 more of you. That should be enough to strengthen me for what comes next. Samuel lunged forward, attempting to grab the masked figure, but it moved with inhuman speed, stepping aside and catching his wrist in a grip that made him cry out in pain. Where its fingers touched his skin, angry red marks appeared, the same symbols that had covered Harrison's body. Your mind is disciplined, scholar, it said, its voice almost gentle. You would make an excellent vessel for a fragment of my awareness. I grabbed one of Luca's herbal bundles that hung at the entrance of the tent and, operating on pure instinct, thrust it toward the masked figure. The effect was immediate and shocking. It recoiled with a shriek, releasing Samuel, who collapsed to his knees, clutching his marked wrist. Mountain ash and grave soil, Luca said, moving to stand beside me, with another bundle in hand. The old barriers. The masked figure hissed, the sound disturbingly inhuman coming from what had once been Tessa's throat. Your folk memory serves you well, descendant of the Watchers, but such primitive magics merely delay the inevitable. It retreated into the darkness, its parting words hanging in the air behind it. I will feed tonight, whether you offer yourselves willingly or not. After so long imprisoned, my hunger knows no bounds. In the silence that followed, I turned to Luca, who was already preparing more of his herbal bundles. You knew, I accused. You knew what was in that tomb. He nodded grimly. My family has passed down the stories for generations. We are descended from those who helped the king imprison the entity. We were charged with keeping watch over the tomb, ensuring it remained sealed. His eyes, dark with ancestral guilt, met mine. But over centuries the duty became legend. The legends became myths, and eventually most forgot the truth behind the stories. What is it exactly? Samuel asked, still cradling his marked wrist. The texts call it many names, Luca said. The thirsting one, the shadow between worlds, the golden hunger. It is not a god as we understand them, but something older, something that existed before humanity and will exist long after. It feeds on human essence, what you might call the soul. And the mask, I pressed. A prison, as I told you, created by 13 willing sacrifices who gave their essence to forge chains strong enough to bind the entity. He glanced towards the tomb entrance, visible as a deeper darkness in the night. But prisons can be escaped if one finds the right key. Tessa, Samuel murmured. She was susceptible, Luca agreed, open to its influence. When she first touched the mask, it recognized her potential as a vessel and began the process of preparation. We spent the remainder of the night huddled together, Luca's herbal bundles placed in a protective circle around us. None of us suggested retrieving Harrison's body from his tent. Some primal instinct warned that approaching it would be dangerous, that what had once been our colleague might no longer be empty. As the eastern sky lightened with dawn, we tried the satellite phone again. This time, miraculously, we got a signal. Samuel quickly arranged for emergency extraction, citing a medical crisis and environmental hazards. Given Harrison's death, it wasn't even a lie. The helicopter will be here by noon, he reported, relief evident in his voice. We just need to hold out until then. But as morning fully arrived, revealing a campsite shrouded in unnatural mist, I knew our ordeal was far from over. The entity, wearing Tessa's body and the ancient mask, would not simply allow us to leave, not when we represented the first opportunity for it to feed in thousands of years. We need to find a way to contain it again, I said, the scientist in me, searching for a solution, even as my human instincts screamed for flight. The scrolls mentioned how it was imprisoned the first time. Through willing sacrifice, Luca reminded me grimly. 13 souls freely given to forge the binding. We don't have that luxury of numbers or time. There must be another way, Samuel insisted, his scholarly mind still functioning despite the horror surrounding us. The marks on his wrist had spread halfway up his forearm now, pulsing with a sickly light. The mask is the key. If we can separate it from Tessa, perhaps the entity's hold will weaken. And how do you suggest we do that? I asked. You saw how it moved, faster than any human, and it's strong. We still have tools, Samuel said, sedatives in the medical kit. If we could somehow subdue it long enough to remove the mask. Luca shook his head. The body is merely a vessel now. Drugs may slow it, but they won't stop it, and touching the mask directly would risk infection. He gestured to Samuel's marked arm. The entity spreads through contact, like a disease of the soul. The mist thickened around our camp as we debated. Tendrils of white curling between the trees in patterns too deliberate to be natural. I noticed how it avoided Luca's herbal bundles, flowing around them like water around stones. We need to go back into the tomb, I said suddenly, the realization cutting through my fear. The answer is there. In the chamber where we found the mask, the scrolls mentioned a binding ritual, but there must have been a failsafe, some method to recapture the entity if it escaped. Returning to the tomb is exactly what it wants, Luca warned, which is precisely why we might gain an advantage, I countered. It won't expect us to head toward the danger rather than away from it. After some debate, we agreed on a plan. Samuel and I would enter the tomb to search for clues about containing the entity, while Luca remained at camp, maintaining our protective circle and watching for the helicopter. We armed ourselves as best we could. Flashlights, Luca's herbal bundles, and a syringe of powerful sedative from the medical kit. As Samuel and I approached the tomb entrance, the mist parted before us, creating an unnatural corridor that led straight to the dark opening. It felt like walking into the mouth of a predator, voluntarily placing ourselves between its jaws. "It's toying with us," Samuel murmured, his infected arm now tucked inside his jacket to prevent accidental contact with me. The entrance tunnel felt different, longer and more oppressive than before. Our flashlight beam seemed diminished, struggling to push back the clinging darkness. The air was thick with that metallic taste, making each breath an effort. When we reached the main chamber, I noticed immediately that the frescoes had changed. The hunting scenes now showed the golden masked figures, pursuing prey that bore our faces. Samuel, Harrison, Luca, and me, our expressions frozen in terror as we fled through ancient forests. "That's not possible," Samuel whispered, his scholarly detachment finally cracking. "Pigment doesn't change on its own." "Nothing about this is possible," I replied, forcing myself to approach the altered paintings for a closer look. Yet here we are. The stone altar at the centre of the chamber had changed as well. Where it had been bare before, it now held a curved dagger, its blade made of the same strange material as the mask. Not quite gold, not quite metal, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. "I don't remember seeing this," Samuel said, carefully photographing the dagger without touching it. "Because it wasn't here before," came a voice from the entrance to the burial chamber. That terrible multi-layered sound emanating from what had once been Tessa, but I thought you might need it, so I arranged for its return. The entity stepped into the chamber, moving with Tessa's body but none of her mannerisms. The mask seemed to have fused with her face, the edges disappearing seamlessly into her skin. The blade that cut between worlds, it continued, gesturing to the dagger. Forged from the same substance as my prison, capable of severing the bonds between body and essence. The king used it to harvest the 13 willing sacrifices, capturing their energy to bind me. Why show it to us? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Why help us find a weapon against you? The masked figure made a sound that might have been laughter. A weapon? Oh, Eleanor, you misunderstand. I'm offering you a choice. It moved closer, its movements fluid yet wrong, like a puppet controlled by inexperienced hands. Join us willingly. Offer your essence as the others once did. In return, I will show you wonders beyond human comprehension. The others didn't volunteer to be consumed, Samuel said. They sacrificed themselves to imprison you. Details lost to time, the entity dismissed with a wave of Tessa's hand. Their energy sustains me still, their awareness preserved within my consciousness. They have witnessed eternity through my perception. As it spoke, I noticed something troubling. Tessa's body was changing, becoming gaunt, the skin taking on a golden sheen that matched the mask. The transformation was progressing, the vessel being remade to better accommodate its occupant. What happens when her body is used up? I asked, a horrific suspicion forming. You'll need another, won't you? The masked figure tilted its head in that unnatural way. Vessels are temporary, essence is eternal. Without warning, Samuel lunged forward, the syringe of sedative aimed at Tessa's neck. The entity moved, with impossible speed, catching his wrist in mid-strike. But instead of defending itself, it pulled him closer, pressing his hand holding the syringe toward Tessa's throat. If it comforts you to believe you have agency in this, by all means, it said as the needle pierced skin. To our surprise, the sedative appeared to have an effect. Tessa's body swayed, its movements becoming less fluid. The entity looked down at its vessel with something like surprise. Interesting, it murmured. The chemistry of flesh still imposes certain limitations. It stumbled slightly, catching itself against the altar. A temporary inconvenience. Samuel and I exchanged glances. This might be our only opportunity. I moved toward the dagger while Samuel positioned himself to restrain the weakened entity. That blade cannot harm me, it said, voice slurring slightly as the sedative worked through Tessa's system. It was made to harvest, not destroy. We don't want to destroy you, I lied, carefully lifting the dagger from the altar. It was unnaturally light, like the mask had been. We want to understand you. The entity made that terrible laughing sound again. Understanding requires perception beyond human limits. Allow me to show you. It lunged with sudden, renewed strength, catching Samuel off guard. Its hands clamped around his face, thumbs pressing against his eyes. He screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the chamber, and fell to his knees as the entity released him. When he looked up, his eyes had changed. The whites were now shot through with gold, the pupils expanded until nearly no iris remained. Samuel, I called, clutching the dagger defensively. I see it now, Eleanor, he whispered, his voice layered with that same harmonic quality that infected Tessa's speech. The spaces between worlds, the thinness of reality, it's beautiful in its emptiness. The entity had infected him completely through direct contact. I was now alone. Your friend was not strong enough to maintain his identity in the face of revelation, the entity said, using Tessa's mouth to form a grotesque smile. But you, Eleanor, with your ordered mind and steel will, you could remain yourself even while hosting a fragment of my awareness. I backed away, the dagger held before me, though I had no illusion it would provide real protection. My foot struck something on the floor, one of Luca's herbal bundles that had fallen from my pocket. An idea formed, desperate and likely futile, but the only option remaining. The scrolls had mentioned 13 sacrifices to create the original binding. We didn't have 13 souls to offer, but perhaps the symbolism mattered more than the number. "What happens if I say yes?" I asked, stalling for time as I bent to retrieve the bundle. "If I join you willingly?" "Transcendence," the entity promised, its voice caressing the word. "Your consciousness would expand beyond the limitations of human perception. You would see the underlying structures of reality, taste the essence of existence itself." "And Tessa? Samuel? What remains of them?" "They are preserved within me, as all vessels are." The entity gestured with Tessa's increasingly golden hand. "Their unique perspectives enrich my understanding of humanity." I clutched the herbal bundle behind my back, my other hand still holding the dagger. The entity was focused on me, its attention absolute. It didn't notice when I pricked my palm with the dagger's tip, drawing blood. "A willing sacrifice carries more power than one taken by force," I said, repeating what we'd learned from the scrolls. "Isn't that right?" "Indeed," the entity agreed, taking a step closer. "Freely given essence resonates with greater potential." I let my blood drip onto Luca's herbs, hoping his ancestral knowledge contained more power than I understood. Then I offer myself with conditions. The entity paused, suspicious but intrigued. What conditions could a mortal possibly impose? "Release what remains of Tessa and Samuel. Let them find peace." I took a deep breath. "And take me as your primary vessel instead." The masked figure considered this, the eye holes of the mask seeming to deepen as it focused on me. "Their essence is already entwined with mine, but I could minimize their awareness, let them sleep within the collective consciousness." It extended Tessa's hand. "Come, Eleanor, take my hand and accept the blessing of perfect knowledge." I stepped forward, the bloodied herbal bundle concealed in my left hand, the ancient dagger visible in my right. As I reached out, ostensibly to take the offered hand, I dropped the bundle directly at the entity's feet. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A flash of light erupted when my blood touched Luca's herbs, and the entity screamed, a sound of rage and pain that vibrated the very stones around us. It staggered backward, Tessa's body convulsing. I lunged forward with the dagger, aiming not for the body, but for the mask itself. The blade struck the golden surface and, impossibly, sank into it as though it were flesh rather than metal. A shockwave threw me backward, slamming me against the chamber wall with brutal force. Darkness took me then, a merciful oblivion that shielded me from whatever happened next. I awoke to the rhythmic thudding of helicopter blades and Luca's concerned face hovering over me. We were outside, the midday sun painfully bright after the darkness of the tomb. "You're alive," he said, relief evident in his voice. "When you didn't return, I feared the worst." My head throbbed and every muscle ached as though I'd been beaten. "Samuel?" I managed to ask. Luca's expression darkened. "He emerged from the tomb an hour ago, but it wasn't him anymore." He helped me sit up slowly. "The helicopter team has him sedated. They think he's suffering from the same disease that killed Harrison." "And Tessa?" "No sign of her." Luca helped me to my feet as medics approached with a stretcher. "What happened in the tomb, Eleanor?" I tried to form words to explain the confrontation and my desperate gambit with the bloodied herbs, but exhaustion claimed me again. The last thing I remember is being lifted into the helicopter, catching a glimpse of Samuel strapped to a gurney, his eyes closed but his lips moving in silent conversation with whatever now lived inside his mind. The official report states that our expedition encountered a rare fungal infection in the tomb, resulting in 2 fatalities and 1 case of permanent neurological damage. The Bulgarian authorities sealed the site as a biohazard, and my university disavowed any connection to what they now term an unauthorized excursion. Samuel lives in a private care facility now. On my one visit, 3 weeks after our return, he spoke to me in that multi-layered voice, describing visions of cities between worlds and the taste of human fear. His eyes flash gold when he becomes agitated. I haven't returned since. As for me, I dream of the mask every night. I see it floating in darkness. The crack where the dagger struck slowly healing, the cruel smile waiting patiently. Sometimes in those dreams, I feel Tessa's presence, not her voice or her thoughts, but a distinctive energy that I recognize as the essence of who she was. The entity promised that those it consumed would live on within it. I fear that promise was true. Last week, I noticed a small golden mark on my palm, precisely where I cut myself with the ancient dagger. It could be a scar, of course, healing with unusual pigmentation. That would be the rational explanation, but rationality failed us in those Bulgarian mountains. It offered no protection against the hunger between worlds. The mark grows larger each day, spreading slowly up my wrist in patterns that resemble the symbols etched around the edge of the mask. Sometimes when I'm not fully focused, I find myself tracing these patterns with my finger, my lips moving in words I don't understand. I write these words as a warning, though I know they will likely be dismissed as the delusions of a traumatized mind. Perhaps that's for the best. Knowledge of the mask's existence seems to draw its attention across the barriers between worlds. But if you find yourself in the remote hills of Bulgaria, and locals warn you of cursed tombs and hungry gods, listen to them. Some things buried in darkness should remain there, sealed away from the light of human curiosity. And if you dream of a golden face with a cruel smile, wake yourself immediately. Don't look into its eyes, don't listen to its promises of transcendence. It lies, it hungers, it waits, and I fear it's not finished with me yet.